A name is the one piece of your history you never had to research. It was simply handed to you at a christening, on a birth certificate at Ellis Island, in a family Bible with a spine so worn the leather has gone soft. Most people carry a Scottish surname the way they carry a birthmark, without thinking about it, without questioning where it actually came from. But inside that name, science can now find something the paper trail never could. Not a story about the name. A story about the blood underneath it. For most of history, that story was unreachable. You had documents, if you were lucky, parish records, tax rolls, ship manifests, the occasional family Bible. And documents lie. Not always deliberately, but constantly, through misspellings, through adoptions nobody recorded, through men who took their stepfather's name, through entire bloodlines who were forced by law to abandon the name they were born with. For centuries, the surname on paper and the biology underneath it quietly drifted apart, and nobody had a way to check how far. Now, there is a way to check. It's called Y chromosome DNA analysis, and for 13 specific Scottish surnames, it has produced results detailed enough to make historians go back and revise conclusions they'd held for decades. Here's the piece of biology that makes any of this possible. The Y chromosome passes from father to son essentially unchanged. Generation after generation, the same basic genetic thread that a surname is supposed to trace, running in parallel underneath it. Because Scottish and Irish surnames have historically been passed down that same paternal line, a man's Y DNA and his surname are, in theory, telling the same story. When they match, the surname checks out. When they don't, something happened along the way that the paper record never captured: an adoption, an affair, a name change, a piece of history someone decided, deliberately or not, to leave out of the family Bible. Genetic genealogists, most notably the long-running Scottish Origins Project, along with Family Tree DNA's dedicated Scottish Mapping DNA project, have spent well over a decade building databases of these results, comparing thousands of Y-DNA test subjects against documented genealogies, clan histories, and known historical bloodlines. It's important to be clear about what this research actually is, not a single peer-reviewed academic study, but a large, carefully cross-referenced body of casework built up over years by genetic genealogists working directly with test subjects and historical records. And what that body of work has found, surname by surname, is reshaping how Scottish clan history gets told. Here's where most casual assumptions about Scottish ancestry go wrong immediately. People assume that any surname starting with Mac or MC points to one single unbroken bloodline. It doesn't, and understanding why is the key to everything that follows. Scottish surnames actually formed in several completely different ways. Patronymic names like MacDonald or Robertson literally mean son of someone Donald, Robert, and spread down through direct paternal lines. Occupational names like Stewart, originally meaning steward or smith, spread because the job existed in dozens of communities across the country, with completely unrelated men picking up the same label because they did the same work. And territorial names like Campbell, Fraser, or Murray spread through land ownership and regional power, meaning a name could belong to a chief's direct descendants and 100 miles away to a tenant farmer who simply lived on Campbell land and eventually adopted the local name. The result? The same surname can represent 3, 4, sometimes 20 biologically unrelated paternal lines that never share a common ancestor. DNA doesn't care which category your name falls into. It goes straight to the chromosome. And for 13 surnames in particular, that chromosome has a lot to say. Start with the biggest name in Highland history. For centuries, the chiefs of Clan Donald were among the most powerful landowners in the British Isles, second only to the crowns of England and Scotland themselves, controlling the Western Highlands and the Hebrides as the lords of the Isles. But why DNA testing has revealed something the clan's grand political history never could. Not every MacDonald shares the same paternal line. What the genetic genealogy work has found is that a MacDonald's DNA matches tend to cluster with the surnames of whoever their medieval ancestors' actual neighbors were. A MacDonald tracing to the Isle of Skye tends to match MacLeods and McKinnons, the clans who shared that territory. A MacDonald tracing to Glencoe tends to match Stuarts and Menzies instead. The DNA isn't just confirming you're a MacDonald. In many cases, it's narrowing down which branch and which valley your specific line came from, a level of geographic precision that no surviving written genealogy could offer on its own. If there's one surname whose DNA tells a genuinely dramatic story, it's this one. In 1603, King James VI outlawed the MacGregor name outright following a bloody series of clan feuds. Under penalty of law, people carrying that name were forced to either live as outlaws or take a different surname entirely. Entire families became Campbells, Grants, Stuarts on paper. In blood, they remained exactly who they'd always been. Because Y-DNA doesn't care what name a person was legally forced to use, the MacGregor DNA Project has been able to trace multiple distinct paternal lineages that all connect back to men who lived through that 1603 prescription, some of them found today, in families who have carried a completely different surname for 400 years with no living memory of the switch. The name was erased from the record. The chromosome kept the receipt. The Campbells built one of the most institutionally powerful noble families in Scottish history, producing earls and eventually dukes of Argyll, a clan that expanded not primarily through conquest, but through calculated marriage alliances and land acquisition. Genetic genealogy research on the Campbell surname shows a bloodline that's both old and remarkably, still identifiable as a coherent genetic signature among descendants scattered across multiple continents today, a reflection of just how effectively the original Campbell patriarchs consolidated their line before the diaspora scattered their descendants around the world. The name sounds almost French, and that's because it more or less is. The Frasers arrived in Scotland as Norman knights in the 12th century, and their Y-DNA signature reflects exactly that continental origin, a haplogroup lineage distinct from the indigenous Pictish and Gaelic bloodlines they eventually settled among and, in time, came to dominate. The clan went on to produce Lords Lovat and Earls of Saltoun. What the genetic record adds to that history is a striking image. The Fraser Y chromosome is quite literally a living genetic bridge between medieval Norman France and the Scottish Highlands, a connection that's been sitting invisibly in the blood for over 8 centuries. No surname on this list carries more historical weight. The name comes from the office of Royal Steward and the Anglo-Norman Fitzalan family, whose name literally means son of Alan, became the progenitors of the Royal House of Stuart, the dynasty that ruled Scotland for centuries and eventually claimed the English throne as well. Here's the twist genetic genealogy has uncovered, though, and it's one that surprises a lot of Stuarts. A significant portion of people carrying the Stuart surname today don't carry the specific Y chromosome signature associated with the documented royal line at all. Their ancestors weren't royalty. They were literal stewards, administrators, or servants who picked up the occupational title as a surname with no biological connection to the crown whatsoever. 2 men can share the exact same last name, the exact same tartan, and trace to 2 entirely unrelated origins, one to a king, one to a steward's desk. For the first time, DNA can actually tell you which one you are. The Mackenzies trace back to 13th century Scotland. Their name derived from the Gaelic Mac Sinasich, son of Kenneth, a personal name closely tied to Scottish leadership during that era. Mackenzie Y-DNA carries one of the most distinctly Gaelic signatures of any major Highland surname, tracing directly back to Irish Gaelic settlers who crossed to Scotland more than 1,500 years ago, and eventually built a dynasty controlling vast stretches of the Northwest Highlands. Few names in Scottish history carry more emotional weight than this one, thanks to William Wallace's role in the Wars of Independence. But the DNA behind the name tells a story that has nothing to do with Highland warfare at all. Clan Wallace was rooted in the west of Scotland, particularly Renfrewshire and Ayrshire, and the surname itself is generally understood to derive from an old word meaning Welsh or foreigner, pointing to Brittonic-speaking origins, not Gaelic or Pictish ones. The Wallace Y chromosome traces to descendants of the ancient Celtic-speaking peoples of southern Britain, pushed north by Anglo-Saxon expansion centuries before Wallace himself was born, meaning the man who became Scotland's most famous symbol of resistance against one conquest descended from people who had already survived an earlier one. This is where the DNA results tend to genuinely surprise people. Broadly speaking, a Y-DNA result in the R1b-L21 haplogroup points toward Irish Gaelic origin, while the I2A2A1A1L369 haplogroup is associated with pre-Roman indigenous ancestry in Scotland. The lineage some researchers describe informally as Pictish. The MacLeods, the great clan of Skye and Harris and the lords of Dunvegan Castle, carry neither. Their signature points north and east to Scandinavia. The MacLeod name itself likely derives from the Old Norse personal name Ljótr, and the Y-DNA backs it up. At their biological core, the MacLeods descend from Norse settlers who came ashore on the Isle of Skye more than 1,000 years ago and built a dynasty that outlasted the Viking Age itself. The Sinclairs controlled the Lothians, Orkney, and Caithness, making them one of the most geographically expansive noble families in Scotland. Their Y-DNA signature reflects that expansive footprint directly, carrying both Scandinavian ancestry. Orkney was Norse territory for centuries before it became Scottish, and Norman French ancestry, since the Sinclairs originally arrived as Norman knights before pushing north into land, still shaped by Viking heritage. The Sinclair Y chromosome is essentially the genetic record of two separate waves of Northern European migration meeting in one of Scotland's most remote corners. Known in Gaelic as Clandonchaid, children of Duncan, the Robertsons trace their lineage to the ancient Celtic earls of Atholl. Genetic genealogy research shows the Robertson Y-DNA sitting firmly within the R1b-L21 haplogroup, carrying a distinctly Highland Gaelic signature that traces back, largely unbroken, to Iron Age Celtic populations in the British Isles. A paternal line, in other words, that predates Rome ever having heard of Scotland at all. The Grahams are a border clan rather than a Highland one, shaped by centuries of conflict along the frontier with England. The name itself means roughly gravelly homestead, a territorial label, not a patronymic one, which reflects a broader pattern in how lowland Scottish surnames actually formed, where Highland names like MacDonald or MacGregor functioned as direct biological claims. Son of Donald, son of Gregor. Lowland names like Graham functioned as claims about land. This family belongs to this ground. Fittingly, genetic research shows far more Y-DNA diversity within the Graham surname than within most Highland clan names, precisely because the naming system itself was never as tightly tied to a single bloodline. Historically, one of the most powerful Highland clans, the Mackays fought in countless conflicts, including against Jacobite forces, and controlled substantial northern territory around Strathnaver. What sets Mackay DNA apart is its unusual diversity. Genetic research has found a wider spread of distinct haplogroups within this surname than in most major clan names, suggesting the Mackays functioned less like a single expanding bloodline and more like a political confederation. Multiple originally unrelated paternal lines that banded together under a shared name because of shared territory and shared military interest, not shared ancestry. The Gordons were among the most politically significant noble families in northeast Scotland, producing earls who shaped the region for generations. The name is an anglicized version of a Gaelic word generally translated as beloved or spacious fort, another surname that blurred the line between territorial designation and personal identity. Gordon Y DNA is heavily concentrated in Aberdeenshire and the surrounding northeast, and it stands as one of the clearest documented examples of what genetic genealogists call a surname founder effect. A single, powerful patriarch producing so many descendants that his specific Y chromosome signature comes to dominate an entire region for centuries after his death. Step back from the 13 individual names, and a bigger picture comes into focus, one that explains why this kind of DNA research matters far beyond genealogy hobbyists. Between roughly 1750 and 1860, an estimated 150,000 people were forcibly removed from the Scottish Highlands during the Highland clearances, their communities dismantled, and their descendants scattered to Nova Scotia, Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. The practical effect of that displacement went beyond breaking up communities. It broke the chain of oral genealogical transmission that Highland families had relied on for centuries, the passed-down knowledge of exactly which glen, which chief, which bloodline a family belonged to. In many families, that specific knowledge was lost completely, sometimes within a single generation of displacement. What wasn't lost was the DNA itself. Genetic genealogists working with Scottish origines have found that roughly 1 in 5 Scottish surnames remain so geographically concentrated that the name alone functions as a near exact record of where a family's paternal line originated in Scotland. For the other 80%, the surnames that spread, diluted, and scattered across generations of migration and displacement. Why DNA testing has become essentially the only tool precise enough to reconstruct what the surname alone can no longer tell you. There's a more delicate layer to all of this worth being honest about. Non-paternity events, the clinical term for situations where the man recorded as a child's father in the historical record wasn't the biological father. It's an uncomfortable subject, and it always has been. But why DNA testing has forced it into the open. The McGregor DNA Project alone has documented multiple distinct paternal lineages within a single surname, a result researchers attribute to a mix of historical adoption, fosterage, undocumented non-paternity events, and the absorption of allied families under one clan name over centuries. Scaled up across Scottish clan genealogy, broadly, that means a meaningful number of people who believe they carry an unbroken paternal line to a specific chief or historical founder simply don't. That's not a scandal. It's the ordinary expected residue of 800 years of war, famine, migration, and the messy realities of human life. But it does leave anyone who gets a surprising DNA result with a genuinely hard question. Which version of your identity is more real, the one on paper or the one in your blood? Perhaps the single most disorienting finding to come out of this research: individual Scottish surnames frequently contain 20 or more genuinely distinct paternal lineages, each representing men who have not shared a common ancestor in over 1,000 years, despite carrying the identical name today. 2 men can share a surname, a hometown, a tartan, and a seat at the same Highland Games, and their Y chromosomes can trace to 2 completely separate, unrelated founding populations. And yet none of that makes the shared identity any less real. The culture is real. The tartan is real. The clan gatherings. More than 500 clan and family associations are active around the world today, regularly hosting reunions from Nova Scotia to Georgia to Queensland, are real, and they matter to the people who show up to them, regardless of what a wide DNA report says about the biological history underneath the name. This is where science runs into a question it was never built to answer. Genetic genealogy can tell you with real precision where your direct paternal line likely originated, what ethnic migration wave it belongs to, and whether the documented history behind your surname matches your actual biology. What it cannot tell you is whether that biological answer is the one that matters most. If your surname is MacDonald, but your Y-DNA traces to a completely separate paternal origin, with no connection to Somerled, the legendary 12th century founder of the MacDonald dynasty, are you still a MacDonald? The DNA can answer the biological version of that question with total confidence. It has nothing to say about the cultural one. What all 13 of these surnames point to, taken together, is a fairly simple idea dressed up in a complicated amount of science. Identity in Scotland was never purely cultural or purely biological. It was both, tangled together for centuries, and then deliberately pulled apart by clearances, colonization, forced name changes, and the ordinary chaos of migration. The written record reflects the version of history that survived those disruptions. The Y chromosome doesn't care what survives on paper, it simply kept replicating, father to son, generation after generation, through outlawed names and forced relocations and transatlantic crossings, carrying a specific and traceable signal the entire time. For the growing number of people, and many of them third and fourth generation descendants in the United States, Canada, and Australia, now researching original Gaelic spellings, their families abandoned generations ago, or discovering Scottish ancestry they never knew they had through a DNA test. That signal is finally being read back to them, not as a metaphor, as a chromosome. The paperwork was never the whole story. It never could be. It was written by whoever happened to be holding the pen at the time, shaped by displacement, illiteracy, forced relocation, and the simple limits of what a census taker in 1841 could actually verify. The blood kept a more complete record the entire time. It just took until now for the technology to catch up enough to read it properly. 13 surnames, thousands of years of migration compressed into a haplogroup, and for everyone carrying one of these names today, a question that no historian and no DNA test can fully answer on its own. Now that science can finally tell you where your blood has actually been, does it change who you understand yourself to be?